Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Judith Jill, and as the incoming president of the Latin American Relief Fund, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Report from the Mexican Borders. Our mission at the Latin American Relief Fund, or LARF as we commonly call it, is to provide humanitarian aid to Latin American migrants and refugees, especially those from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. Since 2017, we've provided funding for Albergue Aba, a migrant shelter in Celaya, Mexico. There, Pastor Ignacio and his family provide food, clothing, hot showers, and a place to sleep for many migrants traveling through Mexico. Last year, with the generous support of our donors, we helped Pastor Ignacio purchase Aba House. This past year, while Aba House provided services to about 4,000 people in 2020, in 2021, it looks like it's going to be closer to 12,000 people, triple the number that it has been in the past. And Aba House also, if you don't already know this, is the only shelter in Mexico that provides services, care and rehabilitation service for amputees, people who have fallen off the trains or being hit by cars and have lost limbs in Mexico. So funding their work is more important than ever, and I just really hope that everyone will reach deep and possibly become what we call an amiga de Aba house, amigo or amiga de Aba house, and find it in your heart to donate monthly to the organization, even if it's just $10. It makes a difference to have regular monthly income coming in to support the work that Aba House does. So I just want to encourage that for everyone to think about that. So I would like to introduce, I want to say that the Board of LARF established this webinar series to keep our donors and interested people in the loop about the status of migration in Mexico and in Latin America. So today I'm happy to introduce three dedicated women who are working directly with migrants at Mexico's southern and northern borders. Careen Shannon, who will moderate today's conversation, is a lawyer with more than 30 years' experience practicing U.S. immigration law. Based in New York City, she is a part-time resident of San Miguel and has provided both legal and financial support to Albergue Aba. She has also traveled numerous times to the U.S.-Mexico border to provide pro bono legal services to immigrant families being held by the U.S. government in detention camps in Texas. Victoria Bruce is a filmmaker and author with a background in geosciences. She is the producer and director of 4 feature documentary films that have screened around the world and been broadcast on HBO, PBS, History Channel, and many other outlets. She is the recipient of the DuPont Columbia University Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. Victoria is the author of 4 books on topics from volcanoes to international politics. Currently, she has been traveling to Mexico's northern and southern borders to film 4 women attorneys who are meeting the migrant crisis head on. Rebecca Eichler has over 20 years' experience practicing immigration law in Washington, D.C., and providing disaster legal aid around the world and working with clients seeking protection under the U.S. and international law. A board member of LARF and a U.S. Army veteran, she currently lives and works in Mexico as a human rights advocate, advising deportees from the U.S., migrants in transit, and asylum seekers at the border. So we hope you enjoy today's webinar.
Thank you, Judith, for that kind introduction and all the background. Welcome, everybody. So glad to see you here today. I'm really happy to welcome the award-winning filmmaker, Victoria Bruce, to talk to us today. As Judith alluded to, Vicky's in the midst of making an exciting new film. It's actually called Las Abogadas, and it tells the story of migration to the United States through the lens of 4 female attorneys, or abogadas in Spanish, who have been on the front lines. They've been on the front lines in various ways, including advocating for asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border and providing legal advice and support to migrants making the journey north through Mexico. And one of those abogadas who will be featured in the film is San Miguel's own Rebecca Eichler, fellow American immigration attorney who's lived in San Miguel, I think, for about 3 years. And since that time, she's found all sorts of ways to provide support to migrants and refugees passing through Mexico. So to get us started, Vicki, let me start with you. I know you've been to the US-Mexico border a number of times in the course of making your film. And I understand that you recently traveled to Matamoros on the US-Mexico border just south of Brownsville, Texas. This is an area where notoriously under the Trump administration, thousands of would-be asylum seekers were stranded for months or even years in makeshift tent camps on the streets of a very dangerous city. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw on your most recent trip there?
Sure. Thank you so much, Karine, and thank you, Judith, for having me, and thank you for the work that LARF does. I got to see that up close and personal. I know we're going to talk about that later on, but I want to thank Rebecca for bringing me into this world, right? So I've always cared deeply about the refugee and migrant and immigration. I'm from Southern California, so I'm very, it's always been drawn to me. And I think that, Rebecca being this incredible person that she is the reason that I'm now doing this work. So I think to talk about my most recent trip to Matamoros, I actually have to go back to my first trip to Matamoros because these were the bookends of COVID, the beginning and sort of coming out of COVID, right? Or we weren't completely coming out of COVID, and there weren't vaccines yet, but Biden had won and people felt like they were breathing again. But right before COVID, I had been to Matamoros. I had taken a cameraman with me, and the idea was to film Charlene de Cruz and Rebecca Eichler, who have this buddy system that they've used throughout Mexico. A lot of you may know that they, were the ones who went out to the migrant caravan in 2018. Doing asylum charlas from her van, which is one of the reasons like she's such a great character. And so it was to go see how they're working and how they're helping in this time of Trump and MPP and all these migrants bottlenecking at the border. And I thought that that would be like a really good way to show what was going on. And at the time, the migrant camp, and Rebecca would tell me late at night, she's like, I feel, she was a little jealous that I got to be in the camp where she was in the office with case after case after case, sometimes 12 cases a day you were doing. And what had happened is, I think like anywhere, life happens and sort of, whole communities had formed within this refugee camp at the border, and there was the Honduran community and the Guatemalan community, and there were ice cream trucks going through, and there were kids running around playing soccer, and there were a lot of services and Team Brownsville and the doctors that had come in. And so there was a lot of joy there, and a lot of, until you started talking to people and you felt this deep pain, and especially parents, and especially a woman who just found out that a mom sent her kids across that morning alone. And so, but people were living. So fast forward, go through COVID, and very few people were keeping track of what was going on because the borders were closed. And in the time, and I don't know, I guess it was mostly in like the last few months, according to Oscar, who was working for Lawyers for Good Government down there, they started building and covering all the fences. So now they are sort of encaging these people without any way to see through, and then razor wire atop all the fences. So it became this dark, awful thing. And then they weren't letting people in and out. They would let the migrants in and out with military guarding them. And so even journalists weren't allowed in. Some aid workers, Charlene de Cruz told me she wasn't allowed in. She had to get specific, some kind of specific authorization from the military just to get in there and talk to clients. So it was a completely different scene. And I'm just reporting. I don't know what to attribute that to, possibly the end of the Trump administration, the beginning of the Biden administration, and the pressure they were putting on Mexico at the time. And then came the end of MPP. So as a journalist, we got word that it was going to end. And I think you'll all remember the day that it was going to end was the worst ice storm they've ever seen in Mexico, or well, it was in Mexico and southern Texas. like 9 degrees, you know, pipes freezing, people out of power everywhere. So that got postponed. And we ended up, because I couldn't make it then anyway, I thought I was going to miss it. I ended up landing the day that they literally started opening the gates. And these people that had been waiting and in these camps and suffering and not knowing were coming through, you know, like this stream of, you know, this incredible elation and happiness. And at the time, all the volunteer attorneys that had been working there, and all the, not just volunteer attorneys, it was nonprofits, it was for-profits, it was people working, it was Jody Goodwin, Laura, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name right now, but I saw a lot of people that I had met a year earlier. They all formed this team to sort of triage all the migrants as they were getting off the bus and across the border, giving services, giving legal services, giving hotel services, travel services, food, handing out backpacks. It was so fantastic. I mean, it was like, I wanted the film to end right there, because it's hard to find a documentary film with a happy ending. So it was just a great experience, and I was so happy to be there. But it was so powerful, not only to see what the families, you know, this happiness that the families were going through, but also to see these women, mostly women, again, go just like spring into action and create a whole system to bring in thousands of people over the course of a few days.
That's
Vicki,
an incredible story. I'm so glad you were there with your film crew. Go ahead, Rebecca.
I was going to say, you mentioned the MPP and the end of MPP. I don't know if everybody knows what that is. So MPP was a policy enacted by the Trump administration. He called it the Migrant Protection Protocol. Those of us working with it called it the Migrant Persecution Protocols, because it's an Orwellian name. And it was forcing asylum seekers who were legally presenting themselves at the border seeking protection to wait in Mexico while their case made its way through the US immigration system. And what that resulted in is tens of thousands of people who had cases pending in the United States, but being forced to live in Mexico, where they didn't have access to legal advice. They didn't have access to the courts. And prior to COVID, the US government set up these tent courts right on the border. They were basically kangaroo courts. They were not allowed to have any observers. No journalists were allowed inside. It was very much a kangaroo court, being held in secret, with judges being appearing virtually, the US government attorney appearing virtually, and oftentimes the translator appearing virtually, and one person sitting alone in a tent, having to defend themselves, having to explain their most traumatic experience to seek protection from the United States. So this MPP program did recently just end, and actually another part of it, other than it ending, and when Vicki talks about the joy and the elation, it wasn't just that they threw open the gates. There was a process that the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, were taking in Mexico, allowing people, requiring them to register, telling them to show up at the border at a specific time in a specific place. And so that's how that process was working. And one really difficult thing about what was happening in MPP was that many people were not showing up for their courts. And if you don't show up for your court hearing in immigration court, you are automatically ordered deported in absentia. You're automatically ordered deported without your presence. The reason people were not showing up for their court hearings were because they were literally being kidnapped. They might have suffered some sort of crime of violence and given up and turned away and gone home. But mainly it's the people who were not able to go because they were kidnapped at the moment. They were ordered deported. And just yesterday, I don't know, Karine, you've probably heard this as well. Just yesterday, unofficially, right? They're taking steps towards allowing those people who were ordered deported in absentia to reapply and to enter the United States and have a second chance. So I'm heartened by the good things that are happening. Small, poco a poco, little small steps of goodness are happening. But I also think that we have a very long ways to go.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all hope that under Biden we'll have a new regime, as it were. But, you know, even under Obama and also under Biden, we do have a US policy that is draconian in a lot of ways. I'll believe it when I see it in terms of these people that were ordered deported or whose cases were dismissed, what the process will be for them to actually reapply. But we also still have something in the United States that I like to think of as a kind of virtual border, where we go beyond our northern, southern, and ocean borders and try to, for example, enlist Mexico into becoming the immigration enforcement authority for the United States. So Rebecca, I know that you and Vicky were both recently in Tapachula in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas, right on the Guatemalan border. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like and what you saw there?
Yeah, sure. I think you can sum it up in one word. The migrants who are in Tapachula call it Atrapachula. In English, it's Trapachula. They are stuck there. And as Karine mentioned, under Obama, actually in 2014, Mexico instituted its southern border policy, which basically outsourced the enforcement of U.S. border policy, U.S.-Mexico border policy to Mexico's southern border. So putting the pressure on Mexico not to let migrants into Mexico at all, so that those people wouldn't come into the United States. And it's been successful. There's fewer people shortly after the enactment of the southern border policy. Much fewer people were coming into the United States, but that was enacted under Obama in 2014. It's being enforced by a newly formed Mexican National Guard that was formed in 2019, again, under pressure from the United States, under threats of tariffs that Trump was giving to Mexico, forcing them to create a whole nother law enforcement arm, the Mexican National Guard, and they're the ones who are charged with enforcing basically U.S. border policy in Tapachula, along the whole southern Mexico, between Mexico and Guatemala. It's very troubling because there are, WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, reports increased human rights violations. Many children are sent back to, just sent across the border back to Guatemala. So there aren't the protections that should have existed. And the fact is that Mexico previously had been very generous. Migration wasn't a crime. It wasn't criminalized in Mexico. Mexico is, believes in free movement of people, but under pressure from the United States government was being forced to crack down on people coming in. So the things that we saw in Tapachula, one thing that really surprised me was the number of Black migrants. Many people from Haiti. We'd heard that, Vicki, I don't remember if you remember the number, but I think in 1 week they had something like 1,000, maybe 5,000. They had a huge number of Haitians were stuck. And it's interesting, as Karine says, it's sort of this virtual border. There are people who are legally in Mexico who have maybe received a humanitarian visa by the Mexican government. Maybe they've received refugee status by the Mexican government, but specific to the state of Chiapas, specific to these southern states, they don't let them leave. There are military checkpoints as you go through the state. And unless you have, if you have these papers that are completely legal and acceptable for travel anywhere else in Mexico, they don't let you leave the state of Chiapas. It's turned into this really bizarre, police state. I don't know what a good word to describe what that was. It was just, it works on its own rules down there, at least in Chiapas. I suspect that it would be the same in the other bordering states, but it is 100% a result of U.S. funding, both funding that the U.S. gives to Mexico in order to enforce these border policies, and also a combination of pressure, diplomatic pressure. As I mentioned, that Trump was saying, you know, was pressuring Mexico under threat of tariffs to enforce the border down there. And I believe I heard somebody say that, you know, the next step is Guatemala is then going to be pressured to enforce U.S. border policies. So it's just getting pushed further and further. And it's what, in my opinion, it's illegal. It violates international law. I wouldn't be surprised if it violates Mexican law, because it certainly violates U.S. law, what had been happening with the MPP program and everything else. So
Well,
Vicki,
the
if you
Trump
wanted
administration already tried that with the safe third country agreements with Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, which I think the Biden administration has rescinded. But that was another example of trying to outsource our immigration enforcement way beyond our borders.
Absolutely.
Vicki, did you have a chance to talk with and maybe film any of the Haitian refugees that we're talking about in Chiapas?
Sure. I talked to a lot of people from a lot of different countries. I don't speak French or Creole, so the Haitians were, I did speak with one Haitian guy. So when Rebecca talks about enforcing the borders, let me just give you an idea of what it looks like, because it doesn't look like they're enforcing the borders. Okay. So if you, like literally, you can take 2 tractor inner tubes and put some boards on the top and go right across the river, and there's no military stopping anyone anywhere. Okay, there's no people capturing anyone. We went to 2 different crossing areas, and the migrants and also day laborers from Guatemala come to work in fields and, you know, different businesses in Mexico. And it's just and they also have commerce going across. And then the legal bridge is right next to it. And so, you know, no one goes on the legal bridge because you have to show your paperwork and there's a long line and everything else. I saw refrigerators going back and forth, right? People are stocking a Corona this high on a, you know, but this is also the same way that migrants come, that I've talked to them, that they've come that way. So it's not like here where you come over the fence and you're immediately apprehended by Border Patrol. There's no Border Patrol, right? So they come in to the city, right? This is what I saw. They come into these 2 port towns, and one of them's like super cool. Like you can have a beer and there's hammocks and there's music playing and, you know, the things are going back and forth. The other town is really cute. It's called Talisman. So it's Talisman and Ciudad Hidalgo. Is that right, Rebecca?
Yeah.
And so in the Ciudad Hidalgo, people hang out. It's kind of like a little beach thing, a lot of commerce going back and forth. Some migrants more north up the river, actually it would be east, is Talisman. And there is a, you know, here's the ICE, you know, this is what a reporter from Reuters who works down there told me. So you have this, you know, ICE department, and then you have the bridge, which is the official crossing. And then one after another, there's a 2-lane rope with, you know, teenagers pulling people across. And this is where the river is like rapids, you know, and they're constantly like losing the rope and going down and jumping off, and guys are taking off their pants and putting their pants over their neck and holding a bicycle over their head and going across. So that's what the border looks like. And the Reuters journalist, he said that only at one point they had sent all these National Guard troops to stand at the Ciudad Hidalgo border, but it was more a photo op than anything. So it's not like they do put people in detention. They're constantly deporting them, but all that's happening from Tapachula, which is another hour north. So they're grabbing people off the highways, but the migrants know not to travel the highways.
Exactly.
Right. So they get into town. So now they're in town and they're trying to sign up for Mexican immigration and asylum. And that's the Comar office. So it's a huge office. And in the morning, there's 1,000 people in line. It's 110 degrees. Let's say it's 105 degrees, beating down sun. And they're trying to sign up for these asylum cases where they get told to come back and the people aren't there. If they don't speak Spanish, they're trying to, I mean, it's just a mess. It's a mess. And then once they do that, there are some benefits if they stand in another line of 1,000 people that they can try to get from the Mexican government.
I think
we have a question in the chat whether this is happening only in Chiapas or in some of the other southern Mexican states. But maybe you've answered the question in a way. Are they going to the cities where they know they can apply for Mexican immigration benefits?
I don't, not having been to the other states, I don't know for sure, but I think I can only imagine that it must be, in addition to Chiapas, that it's being enforced in, what are the other border states, Quintana Roo, and I think Chiapas pretty much goes the whole length of it. Campeche, yeah. So, but one thing, what Vicky said is there's not, really ICE and Border Patrol, but in my experience, I've heard a lot of reports of just blatant racism, and you see a Black person walking down the street and the Mexican, National Guard is going to ask for their papers, so just, and I can't tell the difference, but apparently, you can tell if somebody's from Central America, if there's somebody, a Guatemalan, a Honduran looks different than a standard Mexican. And there's no qualms about just, stereotyping and targeting people just for that reason, just based on their looks. And I think, migrants who have been traveling look more haggard, and they will be stopped, just routinely stopped and asked for their papers.
Yeah, not to mention, as Vicky said, we have a lot of people, especially coming from Guatemala, who don't speak Spanish at all or very little, because they are from indigenous communities, and that's part of the reason that they're fleeing.
Right.
So we talked about Matamoros, we talked about the border with Guatemala. I know you both also spent time in Tijuana. Is it different there than other places that you've been along either border?
Aren't you there right now, Vicky?
I'll be there to Friday, but I just found out the Mexican president will be there Saturday and Sunday too. So it'll be interesting. Well, yeah, I think that I definitely want to talk about my trip to the ABBA shelter, because this is a fundraiser for that. And I haven't spent a lot of time in Tijuana, but what I saw is a completely different system, because there's a lot of people living in hotels, and Rebecca had told me that, but Rebecca can talk about Tijuana.
So I was in Tijuana well before COVID, and actually my first visit there was at the very beginning of the Trump administration, and that's when I first heard that the U.S. Border Patrol was metering the asylum seekers, basically controlling the number of people who could apply for asylum and on any given day. And I was completely shocked when Charlene told me this. I'm like, what? And there was a list. There's a book that was being maintained by asylum seekers themselves, and none of it made sense to me. It was like, wait, what? So Mexico is controlling who is allowed to enter the United States. And I realize now, with 3 years of hindsight, that this was the U.S. again putting pressure and testing the waters. Like, let's see what we can get away with. First we're going to limit the number of people who can apply, and then we're just going to shut it all down. And so it was just, these little steps at a time. The news that I heard from Tijuana, there's an organization working there called Al Otro Lado, and they're a binational immigration legal aid organization. And just yesterday, they're in the process right now of reuniting families who were separated under the zero tolerance policy of Trump, that just, anybody who was approaching the United States undocumented, they were taking the kids away from them. And there are children who have been separated from their parents for 3-4 years. And I just saw a video, a really heartwarming and devastating video of a little boy who was separated from his father when he was 5 years old. And now it's 3 years later. And they were at the airport, a reunion at the airport, which was beautiful. But I can't even imagine the trauma that any of these people have gone through. And thanks to the work of dedicated advocates on the border in the U.S. and especially in the home countries, because a lot of these people were deported. The kids may have been deported back to Central America. The parents may have been deported, and there have been advocates on the ground who were interviewing. Charlene De Cruz is one of them. Was interviewing community members and trying to find the parents whose kids were separated from them. So we're making small steps towards humanity, but there's so much to do. So Tijuana is a hard one. I don't have a lot of current experience with that.
Well, that brings me to another question I wanted to ask you, Rebecca. We do know that was one of the most egregious policies under the Trump administration, that heart-wrenching separation of families at the border. Is that still happening? Is family separation still happening?
Officially, it's not happening, but there is this a de facto family separation that's happening. So people, many people outside of the United States, the definition of family is different than the nuclear family. So the United States only recognizes nuclear families, mother, father, children. If you're not a nuclear family and you come to the border, those children are being separated. So currently we're working with a family that consists of an uncle and his 3-year-old niece. And they want to apply to the United States. They want to go there, but we have been telling them that as soon as they approach, as soon as they come to the U.S. border, they're going to separate him from his niece, and she's severely disabled. He's the primary caretaker, and he doesn't know what to do. He's been here in central Mexico for months now and is frozen with indecision because this child is blind. She suffers from, I can't remember what exactly she has, but very, very physically and mentally delayed. And these are the choices that people are being faced with. Go to the U.S., seek protection, but be separated because of this. Another way that family separation is happening is the parents or people, again, these non-nuclear family units are coming to the border, and then they're sending the kids across because kids are not being turned away, but the parents will be detained. So it is happening. Like all of these horrible policies that we're talking about don't exist officially on paper, but in effect, there is still family separation.
So Vicki, to what extent do you think it actually is U.S. policy writ large that is the cause of a lot of the migration that we're seeing from Latin America? Or have I answered my own question?
Yeah, from Latin America, from everywhere else in the world too. Yeah, so that's a hard one. And we saw Kamala go down to Guatemala and be very cruel, in my opinion, about how she spoke to people who are suffering from U.S. policies and interventions and coups to take out governments that were not U.S. friendly. And so I think that barring that we ever take responsibility for those things, which we just had Juneteenth celebration. It's been 130 years since the liberation of African slaves. So maybe in 130 years, we'll see that. I don't see the US liking to take responsibility for anything as long as, the people who are still alive and have participation in it are culpable. So I think that, we just, that is a problem, but it's not for the advocates to solve. I think we just have to work within that system. I mean, and I'm not an attorney. So for me, it's, my goal is to shed light on that and definitely talk about those issues. And then hope that policy changes, but will it? I mean, the things that we've done recently in Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela.
The list goes on.
Yeah.
I liked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's response to Kamala's comment, and she says, we can't help set somebody's house on fire and then blame them for fleeing, because the U.S.'s impact in Central America goes back decades. The geopolitical influence there and the meddling going back to the Cold War and before that, that's where the term banana republic comes from. So, the U.S. was always looking out for the U.S.'s government or business interests, financial interests, and would tamp down any sort of whiff of democracies that were trying to make, inroads towards the people. And the U.S. meddled consistently in that. The University of the Americas, the U.S. trained soldiers who participated in horrific brutal massacres throughout Central America, throughout, in all of the Northern Triangle countries. So, what is happening in Central America that's causing people to flee today is a direct result of the U.S. political involvement over all of this, over all this time. And it's, it needs to be said because, a standard American will be like, why are they coming here? Why can't they stay in their home country? Without realizing, what effect that we've had in causing this.
Absolutely. And Vicki, you mentioned that it's not just Latin America. Isn't it the case that there are a lot of African refugees amassed in Tijuana trying to seek entry into the United States as asylees?
Yes, there are. So one of the attorneys that I follow in my film is named Mulu Amalahu. She's from originally from Ethiopia. She's an American attorney from Los Angeles. And she realized, this is before COVID, that maybe a year before COVID, all of these Black migrants were coming north and they were bottlenecked by Trump's policies. And they would try to get up into that metering program and put their name down, but their name would never come up. Their number would never come up, right? And they didn't speak the language and they didn't have the services, because all the services there were in Spanish. And so she started going down there and just on her own with some Ethiopian bread and thought, I'll deliver this and try to talk about what US asylum law is and prepare these people for their credible fear interviews once they get through. And what she found was that there are Africans from many, many countries and for various reasons. And there are a lot of, as we know, there's a lot of conflict in Africa as well, in different countries.
I wanted to add that, the African migrants often have made a journey that's, well, clearly they've gotten to, their journey from Africa to our continent, but they're flying to South America, to Ecuador, because they don't need visas. And then they're walking the whole length of Central America. They're crossing what's called the Darien Gap, which is, I think it's like a 30-mile stretch of jungle that's so inhospitable that there's no road that goes through there. And it's a several-day journey to walk through the Darien Gap. And the people that I've spoken to who have experienced that, I would say probably about 90% have been robbed, beaten, or killed, have suffered some sort of extreme violence in that journey. And so, the fact that these African migrants are also in Tijuana, they have not made the same journey at all as the Central Americans. And the point that I want to make is, those of us who live in Mexico, when we've driven to the border, you see how desolate and how horrible that whole thing is. And it's almost a test, just the fact that you've gotten to the border, you should be allowed into the United States, in my opinion, because you are the people that the U.S. wants. You are the people that, the energy that is in, that's what makes the United States such a power, is the people and the people who have tested themselves just by getting there is extraordinary.
I interviewed Josh Rubin on a show that I do out of Annapolis, Maryland, and he's a Witness on the Border website, Facebook page. It's phenomenal. And, one of the things he said when we talk about that is you shouldn't have, being poor and not having food is enough, should be enough, right? We don't have to say, oh, we caused it, it's the US's fault. We don't have to say, oh, you're a political refugee. We shouldn't have to say any of those things, right? We should have a humanitarian heart and open our arms, like the Statue of Liberty says, to the people that need us, regardless of where they came from, or, it's just, I thought that was a really nice sentiment. I don't know if Karine, we have time to show a little video that we made recently.
Absolutely. We had some questions in the chat about your movie. Her movie is still in progress, but next year you'll be able to see it at a film festival or on TV or anywhere films are streaming. But in the meantime, we have some clips from the Abba House shelter. And as you set that up, Vicki, Rebecca, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the shelter. I know you've been a longtime supporter of Pastor Ignacio and his work, as have many of the people here today. Tell us about the shelter and what he does and what he's expecting to confront in the near future.
Thank you, Karine. I think the most exciting news that we have about the shelter, some of you may know that we embarked on a capital fundraising campaign to purchase the building. And last week, all the paperwork got done, and in typical Mexican fashion, things took a very, very long time. But Ignacio now is the owner of the building that houses the shelter, and we are so incredibly proud of the work that, I think we raised that money in 6 weeks, in a month, and such a great thing. And obviously we couldn't do that without the support from people like you. And I want to make the point that it is such a small operation. It's, Ignacio is a pastor. His daughter Abril is a psychologist there. His wife and children come in often. There's a handful of people, but any donation that you make has such a huge impact. So I encourage you to please contribute as much as you can to helping this, because it's people ask how, what's next, what's the bigger thing, but the role of ABBA isn't to change policy. It's to make this incredibly difficult journey a little less difficult. People can stay there, they get a warm meal, they get a bed, they get hot showers. There are solar water heaters installed on the roof. So people get hot showers, they can wash their clothes, and they can just be safe, because this is not the case in most of the journey, along the whole 3,000-mile journey from Central America to the US border, and that people are constantly running for their lives. So what happens at ABBA, we are also super proud that there has not been a single case of COVID during the pandemic. And that was one of the few shelters that has been allowed to remain fully operational in all of Mexico. I think Ignacio said like one of 3 shelters that remain fully operational, accepting people overnight. They had not a single case of COVID. They implemented very strict segregation policies, protocols they have long-term residents. So ABBA attends to migrants in transit. I believe prior to COVID, they could stay for 3 days before moving on. I think that's been cut down to 1 day. But there are also long-term residents at ABBA who have suffered amputations. As we talked about, the train, people ride on La Bestia on the train, which again, there's been more amputations. People have suffered, there's more injuries as a result of pressure by the US government. Trump was saying, we don't want these people here. So Mexico, whoever's in charge of the train, made sure that the trains were not slowing down at places. They were installing concrete bollards right along the side of the train. So if anybody's hanging off the side of the train, they get hit and knocked off of the train. On the train, there are, huge numbers of criminal elements. Gangs are on the trains. They rob people. If you don't have any money, they push you off. People who are traveling are physically exhausted, dehydrated, and they need to run in order to run alongside the train and jump on and catch onto the train. And that's how, with the wind, the physics of the train suck people under. There's a young woman at ABBA right now who suffered a double amputation right at her. She's got no legs at all. She was trying to get to Monterrey to join her mother, 22-year-old girl, and fell and suffered these amputations. So ABBA, as I believe Judith mentioned, is the only shelter in all of Mexico that has an agreement with the International Red Cross to provide prostheses and rehabilitative treatment for people who have suffered amputations. So we have long-term residents at ABBA that are the amputees, and as well as asylum seekers who are going through the process to get asylum in Mexico. And there are the migrants in transit, and they get a hot meal. They have a full-time cook who prepares hot meals with with meat and fresh vegetables, which again is a very unique thing in all of the shelters. There's a trained psychologist on staff, and Ignacio, who is, really, he calls it just the miracle of ABBA, but he's the conduit of this miracle. And it's a wonderful place that really does need your support. And thank you so much for giving it.
Thank
Great,
you.
Vicki, you want to cue up the film clip?
Sure. I just want to say 2 things quickly. Laura Seltzer-Dunai is here on the call today. She and a crew of 2 others came with me pro bono from the US because we're just ramping up our fundraising now. And I would like to add, thank you, Karine, for also being on board to help us as an executive producer to make that happen. So I'm super grateful for that. This film that you're going to see was filmed by Laura and Brian Litt, our other cinematographer. We are shook by what we saw in that shelter, both the kindness of Father Ignacio and the staff, but also the stories were incredibly painful to see, to watch, and to document. And the lives there, they're our moms, they're our kids, they're everybody. And, you know, we just feel like we have a piece of that still with us, and we'll carry that forever. The film was edited by my son. My son is a 24-year-old Cameroonian refugee who I met in Tijuana last year when I almost didn't go because COVID I was just about to shut everything down. And he is a wonderful editor and cinematographer as well. So I asked him last night at about 5 o'clock, can you put a few clips together so we can show that tomorrow? And so here we are. I'm going to share my screen and play this video. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Karine, your mic's off.
Thank you. You could see my lips moving and no sound coming out. For those who don't know, the lovely man that Rebecca was embracing is Pastor Ignacio. And he is just the most charismatic, loving, gentle man I've ever met, who he has poured his heart into this work. And nothing's more important to him and his family than helping these migrants that come through his shelter. So I know we had some questions in the chat. You should also at this point feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question live. We'd love to hear from you. Rebecca, in the meantime, I'll ask you, is there any sense that there might be another caravan on its way?
There have been several caravans in definitely in the last year, and it seems that they get broken up once they get to Mexico. In Chiapas, I've seen video of the National Guard beating people and physically pushing them away to prevent them from entering into Mexico. So there are, and caravans is not something new. You know, prior to 2018, when I got involved with the caravans, that was my first experience, but there had always been groups of people traveling for safety, traveling in large numbers just for safety, because it is a very dangerous journey that they're undertaking. So, you know, I think there wouldn't have been much focus on the caravans if Trump hadn't have called it out and you know, made a point of it, made a political issue of it. But now there's definitely more awareness of the caravans. I think it exists. People are coming. They are fleeing out of necessity, not because it's a fun trip that they want to take. And I think there always will be, but it's just a matter of how much attention they get and how successful they are as they make their way north.
Yes, when the caravan came through in 2018, as Vicki alluded to, and you'll see in her film in the future, Rebecca and another wonderful lawyer who's also in the film named Charlene de Cruz literally drove into the area near a stadium in a nearby city, not far from San Miguel, and just kind of set themselves up there with signs saying legal advice, come talk to us. And yet you were surrounded by about 5,000 people there, right?
Yeah, it actually, when Vicky was talking about her experience in Matamoros with the camp and it being sort of a festival atmosphere, that's kind of the experience of the caravan was the same way. There was people coming in, and as they were setting up their tents or their sleeping things, they'd bring out a soccer ball, and you could, they were eating food, and so it kind of looked like a festival on the grounds of a sports stadium. But if you, as Vicky said, as you dig in a little bit deeper, you see, the chapped lips, the blistered feet, the children crying, and it's not a festival at all. But yeah.
I'll add a couple of words.
Oh, go ahead.
Because I remember Rebecca's bus so much, and her megaphone, and she was out there doing so much to try to encourage and discourage people from going to the border, knowing what they were going to confront. But some of us also in LARF, and it wasn't known as LARF right at that point. Well, it was, yeah, it was just now then, we had just had it. But we were going with clothes and food on the top of a car and inside, and we expected that we would be deluged with people when they came. No, they lined up. We didn't have to ask them to do that. They lined up. They kept their children in tow, and they carefully came up, and as we handed out food and clothing, they said, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. I had tears coming down my face. And then to come over to Rebecca's big yellow bus and start talking to people. I had a family, a man from Honduras. I know El Salvador because I worked there. And he said, but you haven't been to Honduras. He said, I love my country. I don't want to leave it. But look what happened. His fingers were cut off. His back was scarred from being cut and he said, my mother was murdered. I had to bring my children and take them away. So those are the kinds of stories that Rebecca was hearing every day, and that we were all hearing. And it moved all of our hearts a great deal. So it was a little addition, but Rebecca, you were fabulous.
Thank you.
Rebecca, we have a question in the chat about how lawyers like you are funded for the work that you do. And you could talk maybe about the caravan in particular, how you manage that, how you found help.
The funding, actually, I don't get paid. I do all of this voluntarily. When I've traveled to the border, I've been supported by an organization called Lawyers for Good Government. You can find them online at L4gg.org. For a while, they were funding lawyers' travel expenses to go to volunteer at the border, and they supported me on my trips to Matamoros and Tijuana. But I think they've stopped doing that now, and it's self-funded. It's, I guess, a calling. I don't know. It's something that I know that I can do, and I'm able to do it. And so I do it willingly. The caravan was just me going out there. But it was amazing because I had friends here in San Miguel who were collecting money, and they collected tens of thousands of dollars just on GoFundMe's and bought out the stores from, of Crocs and shoes and blankets and everything they could buy. And it was very welcome. So, organizations like Lawyers for Good Government, there's an organization right now, one of the only ones fully operational at the border, called the Sidewalk School. They're operating out of Reynosa. When the migrant camp was dismantled in Matamoros, everybody got shifted to Reynosa, which is an even more dangerous city. And the Sidewalk School is the only organization that's there. They initially started by providing school for asylum-seeking children, but now they've gone into, identifying the most vulnerable people and connecting them with the services that they need, and as well as attorneys, specifically Charlene DeCruz from Lawyers for Good Government. And they get connected, and then they're allowed to enter the United States once they present the case after Charlene works that. And Charlene I wish she were here, because she's an amazing force of nature. And, yesterday, I think we were supposed to have a meeting tomorrow, and she's like, I can't, I'm helping somebody cross on the border, a vulnerable trans woman. She specifically works with the most vulnerable people. So, if you're looking for something to do, a way to help, I would tell people that unless you're a Spanish speaking lawyer with experience with asylum, I can definitely use that. But everything else, any amount of money that you want to donate, because this is your money is going directly to doing this work, and we couldn't do it without this financial support of people like you. So thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Vicki, any final words from you about what you've seen and what you've learned through the process of making this movie about migration?
Wow, that's a big open-ended question. I want to note that Yasmin Jameson is also here, and she is the project manager on the film, and she was also in Tapachula with us. And I think she had her hand up to ask a question. Are we still taking questions, Karine? Do we still have time?
Sure, go ahead, Yasmin.
Yeah, I guess after listening to everything, as long as the Biden administration still puts pressure on other governments to lock up the borders, even if they do away with the Title 42 and all that stuff, how is that really, how is that going to help people to still get it? Like, he can do away with those, tomorrow, but as long as the borders are locked up, because we're putting pressure, and what happens is then people just start like, oh, we did away with, MPP and Title 42, except for the fact that we still are controlling, you know what I mean? Like, do you think that's, how much of a big difference is that gonna make? I guess.
Mute yourself.
Talk about a big open-ended question. And we forgot to mention.
What can we do to put more pressure? Because what I'm thinking is that, all the people that were, anti-Trump and everything are now saying, okay, we have Biden, everything's going to change. How do we keep those folks still engaged to put pressure on this administration to, change stuff that they were doing back, during Obama time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I did just want to mention, for those who don't know, Title 42 was a public health emergency law that Trump invoked in the wake of COVID to basically shut down the borders. It was convenient for him, right? It's still in place. COVID's not over, so maybe it's understandable that it's still in place, but it's also still a convenient tool for the current administration. And Yasmin, as you said, it didn't start with Trump. My colleague Lisa Koenig and I, who's here on the call, we've been going down to the detention centers since 2014, which started the family detention centers, I should specify, which started in under Obama. So in terms of what you can do, anybody should shout out what they think. Put on pressure on your members of Congress.
I wanted to make a recommendation that I put in the chat, that people should watch a movie called Harvest of Empire to really understand how we destabilized Central America. It really specifically goes into each country and the various things Americans did. And I just also want to remind people that all of this has very, very long historical roots. It goes way before Biden, way before Trump or Obama. It goes all the way back to President Polk, who invaded Mexico on very unjust terms. Basically a trumped up charges against the Mexicans, where we stole 40% of their territory. But anyway, what we can do right now is help, help anywhere we can, whether it's help funding the school, the sidewalk school on the border, or help funding the L4GG.org, or help with funding LARF. This is what we have to do. This is what we can do. And as Cher likes to say, it's just a drop in the ocean, but every drop in the ocean makes a difference. So I just really encourage people to get out there and donate to any organization along the border that you can find.
I would agree with that, Judith. And I would say today we're talking about Abba House, and having just been there, they need your help. They are doing great work, but there are a lot of needs there. It's still a bare bones shelter. It's doing great, but wow, there's just an immense need, and there'll be thousands and thousands of more. And when you feel overwhelmed, you have to stop and look at that one face of that one person that you help, because for them, it is the whole world, right? You change the whole world by changing that one person's life. So I love watching Rebecca, Charlene, Karine, and all of just the people who donate and take care of, you know, one person at a time. It's immense.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks to Gabby, who just mentioned in the chat that she's going to share the link in her social media. It would be great if you would all do that. Let people know about the Latin American Relief Fund and the great work they're doing, supporting ABBA House and other things. And thank you all so much for being here today. This is a really great conversation. Won't be the last time we have these issues to address and to talk about. Maybe we can do this again sometime and give you all an update in a few months. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all. Thank you, Karine.
Thank you.
And we've put the link to donate in the chat. You can also find it on the Latin American Relief Fund's website, LatinAmericanReliefFund.org. We use a platform called Kindest to collect our donations. You can see that they add a tip automatically, but it's up to you. You can scroll down on the tip and change it to 0 because that money does not come. That money doesn't come, you know, to ABBA or LARF at all. It's a tip for managing their platform. So we hope that you are able to donate. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Isabella Carreno, who is an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, and she wants to become an immigration lawyer. So I love that you're here, and thank you, Isabella.
Good. Thank you, everybody, too. It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Victoria and Rebecca, and also Karine. It was a wonderful, wonderful webinar. Very informative.
And we are recording it, and we will put this on our website as well as our Facebook page. So if you want, if you have friends who missed it and are interested in what we said today, please share it with them. Thank you all.
Adios.
Adios. Hasta luego.
Adios.
Bye-bye.